And now we'll have our other two panelists come on stage. The first one is Terrell Baptiste. He's the Associate Director for Regulatory Policy at Gilead. Yeah.
One actually, 1, 2, 6.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
We can all move.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah,
Okay.
great.
Yeah. And now we'll invite Mr. Harsha Rajasimha. He's the founder of India-US Rare Diseases. Yeah.
Good to see you, man.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you, Harsha, for traveling all the way from the East Coast to be part of this policy innovation panel.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
It's my pleasure.
Especially it fits right within the theme India-US healthcare. And when I was venturing into the policy 6 months or 1 year ago, I was reading Gilead's regulatory policy because they had a comprehensive list of what policy means. I think for any people in the audience who are new to policy, that's a good page to go to kind of get an overview of how policy works in the healthcare context. And thank you for bringing us the industry perspective at this panel.
Yeah. It's fabulous to be here, and just want to say these are my own thoughts, not Gilead's. So.
So I'd like you to introduce yourself and talk about the policy work that you have done, the gist of it, and the best policy work that you have done thus far.
Thank you so much, Vidyani, and it's a pleasure to be here on this 25th anniversary of EPPICon. Congratulations, EPPICon, and thanks for the invitation. I'm focused on rare diseases and cross-border collaborations between US and India. For those who don't know rare diseases, a disease is rare if it affects fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. And different countries have adopted different definitions at a national level. And some countries still do not have any definition of what a rare disease is. And so they simply adopt what US FDA's orphan drug definition is from that perspective. And where I have been focused on, coming from a computational biology background, coming through National Institutes of Health and FDA, for the last 12 years after I became a dad to a child with rare disease, and now I have two beautiful daughters, 17 and 10, but we had one child in between with a rare disease. So it became personal to me, in addition to being scientific and professionally aligned. So I started looking at it as a societal problem, as a human problem, without national borders. And so when patients take this advocacy to that, in that personal way, great things have happened in this country and globally. And we see that every day in rare disease. And so I'm excited to share some of the work I have done, but what others have done in rare disease space and what lessons we can all learn for other diseases as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really great to be here, and thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I'm Terrell Baptiste. I'm at Gilead Sciences. I think a lot of these things have been resonating with me, but I was drawn to health policy because I love the intersection of healthcare and really helping marginalized patients. I think that's why I'm here. That's what's really driven me, and that kind of is what brought me to Gilead. And I know that there's a lot of Gilead folks in here, and I'm sure if you know them, they're always fabulous people. So it's it's great to be a part of. And I've spent my career in many different places, but I spent time in Capitol Hill. I've worked in consulting. I worked at the FDA. I've also worked at hedge funds. And really, through all those things that I've seen, is kind of taking a policy lens through that landscape. And we'll talk about this more. But I think thinking about HIV and thinking about how everyone coming together how everyone coming together really got drugs approved and brought people together. I think the other thing that's really important, and I know Aran, as he was pulling down the the banner, is that level of passion that people do have in this space, and figuring out what drives you. I think that's a key and an important point. And all of us up here are here because we're driven to be here.
Harsha, can you talk a little bit about the genetic testing for newborns?
Absolutely. One of the areas when we look at rare disease by numbers, right, over 10,000 named rare diseases, that affect close to 400 million people globally. In the United States alone, there is 30 million people affected by rare disease. In India, it is estimated to be over 70 million people. So when we look at newborn screening as a mechanism to identify these rare diseases early on, because it takes an average of 5 to 7 years to diagnose a rare disease, even today, despite all the advances in genomic technologies and so on, mainly because of lack of adoption. If we were to, the technologies do exist to screen many of these thousands of diseases today, but they're just not adopted. Even in US, where newborn screening is mandatory in all the states, with some level of universal screening panel, which can screen maybe 70 to 80 diseases. But different states have different number of diseases, but it's still extremely small number when you look at the total number of known genetic diseases that are out there. And so one of the things that all the patient advocacy groups in the US are advocating with the legislative government branches as well as the executive branches, first we need a legislation which mandates adopt this technology to screen all newborn babies. There's about 3.5 million babies born each year in the US, and 25 million newborn babies in India. So if you start screening them, diagnosing early is a critical first step in the journey towards treating them or developing new diagnostics or therapeutics. So that's one of the big focus for rare disease communities, especially since 80% of these rare diseases are genetic in origin. If we can screen early, that will be a big win. So that's something we are advocating here in US, but also in India. Where in India, newborn screening is not even a mandatory thing. Only 2% of newborn babies are being screened each year. So it's optional. Those who can afford it, those who are aware and informed, can get it done. The technology is available, but when regulation and legislations are passed, a lot of these things can happen at scale. And so we have seen that happen with the Orphan Drug Act as an example in rare disease world in 1983 when it was signed. That has spurred innovation, and now we have 1,100 or more approved orphan drugs. And so similar type of advocacy work is needed, especially for innovators who are involved in designing therapeutics. The therapy is only useful if patients are diagnosed in a consistent manner, and so that they can access these therapies eventually. So that's something.
Terrell, can you touch base on the diversity needed in clinical trials?
Yeah, well, and I think it's funny because we're kind of asking like opposite ends of the spectrum question, but they do tie together. So I think something to think about when we're thinking about on a global, national, and really regional clinical trial development framework is that, number one, clinical trials these days are global. They are, to Harsha's point, they are everywhere around the world, and there's a lot of complexity that comes along with that. And so I'd say I'm going to leave that section for, or like maybe all of us can talk about it at the same time. But thinking about the United States, if you think about diversity in clinical trials, there's been a real history of and I'm going to be speaking mostly to oncology, and there's many caveats to this as well, but there's been sort of people who have higher incomes, who live close to medical centers are much more likely to receive high quality cancer care. In the community setting, which people, everyone's nodding, I can see, the access to quality care has been quite low. So I think, and I really applaud FDA for thinking about this, and I guess I'll make one point before I say what they've done really well, is I think when you're designing policy, you kind of want to design for the perfect world, right? You don't want to design for the world that we have. And so a lot of the things that you'll see in policy are definitely aspirational. And it's kind of like, how do we get between the gap from what we'd like to see and what we'd see? So I think FDA recently has put out many different guidances that have brought different populations into clinical trials. So thinking about people that have concomitant medication, thinking about people who are very sick. And then recently they put out some guidance that says that you should try to strive for proportional representation on sex, race, ethnicity, and those are the kind of some pillars that you should seek to have a proportional representation in your trials. It's very difficult given what I just said. Getting out into the community setting, that's going to be very difficult. And I think, but I do think that remote decentralized clinical trials, which I think you probably talked about this morning, that is going to change the way things are. And I think really like having more representative trials will lead to more realistic depictions of how a medicine might work in certain populations. Because right now, and we'll talk more about this, we are approving drugs for the top, 5% of the globe, right? And that is just not going to work long term, and there's a huge amount of opportunity.
That's a great point, Terrell. If I can piggyback on that and say that 90% of clinical trials are conducted in 5% of the countries, right? And 10% of the world's population. So rest of the world is largely not engaged in this clinical trial and research enterprise. Particularly when I talk about rare diseases, which is one of our focus areas, is lack of data in clinical trials as a prerequisite is patient registries, right? So to understand how are patients behaving without any treatment, what's the natural progression with standard of care, right? And only then we understand what's the effect of a drug. And so in the US, led by NIH and FDA, over the last 10 years, we have had number of patient registries and natural history studies for many diseases, which are now the target of biotech innovation. And so when orphan drug companies, startups are making new gene therapies and cell therapies, they are targeting diseases for which they are well characterized already, and there is registry and data, a baseline to go after, right? And so that does not exist in the rest of the world. And that's part of the problem we are trying to address is if we can bring India up to speed and get them caught up with having these registries, then I think it can be a game changer.
And Arun was talking about sort of like innovation earlier, and that's really resonated with me because I think everything that we're talking about involves sort of great risk, right, and great difficulty to get there. And I think underpinning innovation needs to be a comfort that you can do that and that you can learn from the innovation that you're having. And I think globally, that's what I'm seeing more and more, we're seeing more and more happening, is that people are putting into place clinical trial systems, clinical trial networks, so that, we can try to produce even higher quality data, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing that I think FDA is doing really well is they have it's called Project ASHA, where they are trying to build up clinical trial infrastructure in India, work with their regulatory bodies. They're also trying to have more clinical trial sites there. So I think things like this and just like envisioning a world where we're all working together, I think that's sort of that's kind of like where we need to go.
So that's a wonderful example of success in this space through advocacy and connecting the dots and working with the Indian Embassy in Washington along with the FDA. They're both in Washington, D.C. local. And so connecting the two bridges has created this channel called ASHA now for cancer clinical trials. Because there is a presidential cancer moonshot initiative, it's important to piggyback on those major momentum and kind of ride it. And so cancer, being the emperor of all maladies, gets a lion's share of attention, funding, and policy attention. So we are trying to see how we can create the similar channel for rare diseases, which is much neglected and lacks funding and attention.
Yeah.
In addition, I'd like to request Arun to comment about the planet health, because pollution, for example, is one of the main risk factors for dementia, and many parts of the world, the pollution levels are very high. So how do policymakers from the environmental policymakers as well as health policymakers come together to actually make policies that are applicable in both the areas.
Yeah, and you mentioned also the importance of making local considerations and local solutions. There's probably no, I think, no, I haven't, this is my idea, but I don't think there's any country that is actually more vulnerable actually to climate change than India. I think both pollution and extreme heat are rising so fast. And some parts, some cities that are kind of downwind from brush fires and things like that are, it's the air quality is really dangerous. I mean, it is a little bit like smoking 1 or 2 packs of cigarettes a day, just being outside. Now, what do you do about that? I think there's lots of, again, there has to be a lot of local solutions, but there are a lot of policy examples of policy that have worked. The Clean Air Act in the U.S. Since the early 70s. I don't know if people remember the days when there was like L.A. was just filled with smog, right? Like this, this layer of some kind of car exhaust fumes, and you change the requirements for tailpipe emissions, and you change the requirements for what industries can do, and it changes. But it takes a long time, But the Clean Air Act has been remarkable in terms of the improvements in air quality. If you look at the improvements in air quality in California, it's gone down until the last few years when the wildfires have been really kicking it back up. And that's another area where obviously policy is going to have to deal with this issue. But I think the solutions have to be local, but very, very important, I think, for India. Same actually with extreme heat and thinking about what to do with that.
Yeah, thank you. Terrell, can you please comment a little bit about the IP for new policy frameworks or the policy innovation that happens in...
Around IP?
Yes.
Yeah, so just thinking about intellectual property, and I think this goes back to sort of what I was saying before. In terms of innovation, I think it's not only sort of like the benefit that you can derive from innovation, it's the learning that you can also derive from innovation. And so when we think about having strong intellectual property in place, that means that innovative companies can come in and take risk and then learn about market and have that be consistent for them. And I think I know that India has made like tremendous strides in this, and India also has just amazing capacity in terms of drug development and also in terms of generic drug development. So I think like as that goes further, you'll see more and more innovative medicines start to come to India. But the other piece that I will put out there, and I think this connects to your conversation with Iran earlier, is all of these things require trade-offs, and there's a bigger picture that has to be considered when you're thinking about innovative drugs. You also have to think, what's the baseline things that we can do? Where can we start? Because we know that there's just great health disparity across many different regions in India, and very severe.
Yeah, to add to that, Vidyani, to what Terrell is saying, I think now India has a great opportunity because of the Biosecure Act of the FDA. FDA commissioner is encouraging biopharmaceutical companies to move manufacturing from China to India and other countries for low cost and high quality manufacturing. And India is one of the countries where FDA has an office, branch office there. And so it's a great time and opportunity for renewing that. And intellectual property, addressing that concerns is very critical for India to take advantage of that. So I think it's a great time from that point of view. The other policy aspect that's affecting all of life sciences, but rare diseases also, is the Inflation Reduction Act of the FDA as well in the last couple of years. That's imposing pricing control on drugs there's no exclusions for rare diseases, which is already overburdened, especially for drug repurposing. And so if a drug is already approved for one rare disease or a common disease, which is being repurposed for a rare disease, that's not receiving the orphan drug incentives of 7 years of market exclusivity and other R&D credits. And so that's hurting patients with rare disease. And so that's something patient groups are advocating from a policy point of view.
Now, at the global level, one thing that we've noticed is The U.S. in some ways not only is it the place where a lot of the innovations happen, but it's also the place where a lot of these drugs are paid for. The market is, you can charge a lot. The insurance companies, there's a lot of money in the market, and as a result, actually, a lot of these drugs can be made cheaper for other parts of the world, and that's happened a lot with HIV, where a year of Truvada in this country is, I don't know, $15,000, something like. I'm not sure. You can be better than me, but in South Africa it's $200, right? So this kind of and it is kind of a global IP agreement, set of agreements that allow that to happen. It is something where people are obviously for many good reasons upset why drug prices are so high in the United States, but part of that is both the ability to make it cheaper for the rest of the world as well as for the R&D, right? So it is a huge incentive. The fact that you can really make you can really sell things at a high price in the United States. It's a huge incentive for drug companies to develop new drugs, and to know that you can make a big profit. If it weren't like that, R&D would certainly not be the same. The R&D environment in the United States.
Well, I think the other thing, or a couple things to consider. I think like all of drug development is really complicated. It's also really highly likely to fail. Most of the
almost all fail.
Yeah, almost all fail. So I think we have about a 5% success rate. So in terms of bringing a molecule from an IND to the market.
12%, yeah.
Yeah. So it's very so I think that underpinning that is this opportunity to be willing to take those sorts of risks and be in an industry that's like this, because it is very topsy-turvy. And on the other side of this is, in the FDA, we have sort of the global health authority that approves medicines. And I think part of the reason why they're so far ahead of other countries is because they get innovative medicines that they have to learn and adapt from. So, sometimes when I think about this, and this is just me talking, not Gilead, but the cost of medicine, like we all want a medicine if we get sick. We all want something for our loved ones. And so we're kind of, when we talk about price, like how price sensitive are you to that, right? So when I think about it, I'm like, we do need innovative medicine because, we have many diseases we haven't done enough for.
100%. Especially in rare diseases, there is enough one clinical trials. That's the extreme form of a clinical trial where there's a single patient and a treatment that's individualized to that one patient. And I believe US is the only country where we have FDA approved, regulated enough one clinical trials that are happening. You can read up the story of Mila, who was the first child that went through that FDA approved trial. Now there's several babies that take advantage of such an opportunity. And so when we talk about drug pricing, that's one of the main barriers for lack of engagement of the rest of the world. The global south, so to say, because they just can't afford the drugs at the prices that US can commercialize here. And so it's unethical to go and conduct a clinical trial in a country where the company has no plan to commercialize. And so in India, that's one of the barriers we heard. And so what we are doing at Indo-US Organization for Rare Diseases is creating such a channel, opportunity for smaller, nimble, innovative biotech companies led many times by families affected by rare disease, coming to India, setting up sites so they can, many of these trials are small population. They may have 30 patients, 50 patients at most. And so even that is hard to enroll all in United States. So they got to go beyond US to recruit. And so, but when they come to India, have a site, investigator site, access the patient population, but then have a plan to commercialize it and stay there so that the patients can access the treatments much after the clinical trials are approved.
Yeah. And I have a question for both Erin and Terrell. So academia and industry partnership actually, they foster a lot of innovations which are instrumental for healthcare. So what do you think are the policy barriers to foster these collaborations?
How about you? If you can talk about the ways that Gilead does work with academia.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't necessarily say that there are huge barriers. I think that we do try to learn as much as we can from the academic setting, and then kind of translating that into medicines. I would say that nature is our greatest enemy, because I do see that we work well together to kind of take ideas, and if they're promising, spin them out. I think, we, like institutions like Stanford, UCSF, et cetera, they are just phenomenal at doing this basic research and then sort of handing that over to industry. I mean, I don't see there being too much of a conflict. I think we're all on the same team, and it's just at different stages.
Yeah, and by and large, certainly Stanford, UCSF, just also being in this area and being close to biotech and pharmaceutical companies. One thing I would say, one area that is, I think, an interesting one, I don't know exactly how that's resolved, is that there's some reservations about, a lot of the basic research actually is funded with public money. And then why is it that in some ways that goes and ends up in the hands of a private company that that then charges much higher price rate when a lot of the development was really done with public money. And so I think there are some questions there that we're all kind of still trying to grapple with. But so I don't know if you've run into any of these issues with.
I would say that that is a large, but a consequence, and I think it goes back to the discussion about risk, right? A lot of people say, oh, you see this drug was approved, et cetera, but you don't see the 95 drugs that weren't approved, and I think sort of to your point, sort of like the fact that there is a balance and that there is a lot of gray associated with this, and I think the other thing that to think about is just how rare it is to have a drug approval. There's probably on average about 40, 45, or 50 new drugs across all diseases approved every year by the U.S. I mean, it's just very, very rare and difficult. And I think like when you could also think about it in this way, is that the benefit to society of a drug and, having people be with their families and having people continue their careers, you see a lot of return on that for the public as well. So it's not the most elegant system, but it is. It has it does change. It's changed all of our lives in here.
And I would say that the connections the universities like Stanford, UCSF have with private companies is actually that has benefited both. And if anything, I would say I would want to have kind of universities that are not quite on the same. I mean, it's very easy to be like, oh, I'll just go to Stanford, right? From if somebody here, I want to know something about some gut microbiome. I know somebody down there. There are lots of places around the country where some of that research happens. It's not as close to this. It's not kind of in the same place in the same ecosystem with other pharmaceutical companies. But I'm sure a lot of if anything, I think it's a mutually beneficial collaboration. I would want to see more of that kind of happen with places that are not kind of the usual suspects.
Yeah. How stringent do you think are the policies for example, devices or diagnostic modalities compared to drugs?
I can go.
Yeah, you've been inside the FDA.
Yeah. So I will say that the complexities around developing drugs are typically a higher bar than in device. Not saying, and I know there's probably some device people here, not saying that there's a ton of complexity associated with it, but I think like the way that you can test devices is 10 times easier than you can test drugs. You're not going straight. You're not starting in rats, then dogs, and then and then people. There's many things that make devices a little bit less elegant and complex to develop. But I think At the same time, the speed at which you can develop devices is also much greater. So.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything else to say.
So I would like to add, although not an expert, from a diagnostics point of view, which was historically regulated in the United States by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. More recently, FDA has expressed their intent to regulate, and I don't know exact status. I'm sure there are people in the room who are more aware and hurt by that in some ways. Already the margins in the diagnostic industry are extremely low, high volume, low margin type activity in diagnostics. And on top of that, they, in addition to the CAP and CLIA based regulation, now there is FDA is also, I wouldn't say threatening, but expressing their intent to provide that oversight. So that's adding a lot of pressure, I would say, given how pressured they already are.
And I'll maybe reveal my slightly too hard-nosed academic credentials, but I would like to actually see a higher bar of evidence for devices than currently exists. I think a lot of times, thank you, I appreciate that. I think a lot of times devices can get approved based on just does it do what it was, does the joint move like it said it would, right? And as opposed to does it actually make a clinical difference? And obviously it's much more difficult to do these kinds of trials. But I actually think that the bar would be good because there's a lot of devices that are approved and we just don't know what they do.
And also for many drugs, from a delivery point of view, they need to make a device first so they can make that injectable in the exact specifications. So they have to first go through a medical device before they can actually get the drug to the trials. So there is a balance there. You don't want to over-regulate the devices so that, so it's Catch-22.
And you're all the policy experts in your own domains. How do you think we can actually bring the policy makers to this kind of conferences and our academic and industry conferences so that they hear firsthand of what needs to be done?
One thing I was talking with Terrell a little bit earlier, and he said like people inside the FDA, they're overworked and underappreciated. If you're in there, half the world tells you you're going too slow, and the other half is telling you you're going too fast, right? And so there's people inside CDC. They're just working way too hard, and they have too many kind of oversights. And so I think a little bit to your question, a little bit, it would be great. In some ways, it should be like a policymaker appreciation week or something like that, right? where they are in many ways they're public servants, and it'd be wonderful to try to get them, but they also recognize that it's a lot of they do a lot.
I'm sort of an old school person in a way, but I think it's you write a letter. Right? And invite them and say why and what constituencies are here and make sure it connects directly to their work. And I think they are super interested to hear that. And I think all of the government agencies, they really want to hear from expertise in the field. They really want to be connected to everyone. And because they're learning just like us, right? I mean, everyone, ideally, we're all curious and we're all learning and we're all trying to see different glide paths. So I think that's a really important thing. And I do think like going out and trying one of those jobs for a year or a couple of years is a really fabulous way to not only like give back because it's public service really, but it's also a great way to like learn and see the inside of different things.
So I would add, the biotech entrepreneurial ecosystem has very well taken advantage of organizations like the Biotechnology Innovation Organization or Pharma, PHRMA, and particularly in rare diseases, the Every Life Foundation for Rare Disease organizes this wonderful 1 week in February, the last week of February around the Rare Disease Week. Rare disease legislative advocacy on the Capitol Hill. And so it's not a one-time activity that you bring them once a year in one place, but it's very important for all the nonprofit patient advocacy groups, industry advocacy groups to go and educate the policymakers. So I have seen firsthand that it's a working government in the US. It works. You got to engage. It's a participatory government and democracy, right? So if we don't participate in it, we don't get it. So I think I'm seeing firsthand, we engage with the corporate alliance members within the rare disease community, and they actually go to Capitol Hill regularly and meet legislators and also the executive branches. So I encourage all of you to think in that way and get involved, and you'll be amazed at what you can accomplish by not necessarily taking on that huge responsibility on our own shoulders as a startup or as an innovator, but knowing that there is a whole ecosystem that you can become a part of, and make sure your voices are heard.
And I guess just to jump on, to piggyback on that, the major thing you can do is figure out what issue is important to you, and you'd be amazed. Like if you just decide I'm interested in almost anything, there's an advocacy group for it. And so I think, and you'll also be amazed if I asked everyone in here, what is the thing that's most important to you? I would get a lot of different answers. So I think finding those people, to Aaron's point, like it's all just comes back to connection. And I think, it's, yeah.
Yeah, no, I thank you for, yes, like it's like the plug I'll put in of getting to know, getting inside the policymaking process, getting to know them. Then you make the connections. Then you have a network of folks to invite from.